Experts used AI to restore this 1870 portrait. What appeared left them speechless. Sarah Mitchell stood in the dimly lit attic of the Beaumont house, her breath forming small clouds in the cold February air. The abandoned Charleston mansion had been sealed for 40 years, and now, as historical preservationists prepared to convert it into a museum, they were cataloging everything inside. "Dr. Mitchell, you need to see this," called Marcus, a young intern from the Smithsonian, holding a dirt-covered canvas. Sarah approached carefully, her trained eye immediately recognizing the age of the frame. Beneath layers of grime and water damage, she could barely make out the shape of a human figure. The portrait was in terrible condition: cracked paint, missing sections, discoloration that turned most of the image into an indecipherable brown mess. "It's from around 1870, I'd estimate," Sarah said, gently touching the corner of the frame. "Look at the style of the wood, the way it's constructed. This was expensive work." Marcus wiped dust from the small brass plate at the bottom. The engraving was worn but still legible. "Portrait, 1870, Charleston." "No name?" Marcus asked. "Not on the plate, but look at the brushwork where it's still visible. This wasn't amateur work. Someone paid serious money for this portrait." Sarah's mind was already racing. Who would commission such an expensive painting in Charleston in 1870? The city was still recovering from the Civil War, the economy devastated, most of the old plantation wealth destroyed. They carefully wrapped the portrait and loaded it into Sarah's vehicle. Back at the Smithsonian's Conservation Laboratory in Washington, D.C., she placed it under specialized lighting. Even with magnification, most of the image remained hidden beneath decades of damage. "I want to try the new AI restoration software," Sarah told her colleague, Dr. James Park, the next morning. "The one from MIT that reconstructed those Renaissance frescoes." James raised an eyebrow. "That's cutting-edge technology. We'd need approval." "This portrait deserves it," Sarah insisted, something in her gut telling her this was more than just another damaged painting. "There's a story here. I can feel it." 3 weeks later, Sarah sat in the digital imaging laboratory watching Dr. Jennifer Chen configure the AI restoration system. The portrait lay flat on a scanning table, bathed in ultraviolet light that revealed underlying paint layers invisible to the human eye. The algorithm analyzes thousands of period paintings to understand brushstroke patterns, color palettes, and artistic techniques from the 1870s, Jennifer explained, her fingers dancing across the keyboard. "It doesn't invent details. It reconstructs what was most likely there based on what remains." Sarah watched the monitor as the AI began its work. The process was mesmerizing. Slowly, like watching a Polaroid develop in reverse, the image began to clarify. Brown stains faded, cracks disappeared, missing sections filled in with ghostly accuracy. "Oh my God," Jennifer whispered. The face of a young black woman emerged on screen. She couldn't have been more than 25 years old. But it wasn't just her youth that made Sarah's breath catch. It was everything else. The woman wore a deep burgundy dress with intricate lace collar, the kind of garment that cost a fortune even in prosperous times. Around her neck hung a stunning emerald necklace, the stones large and flawless. Her hair was styled elaborately, adorned with pearl pins. Her posture was regal, confident, her gaze direct and unflinching. "This can't be right," James said from behind them. "Check the calibration." "The calibration is perfect," Jennifer replied, zooming in on details. "Look at the precision of the jewelry rendering. The AI is showing us exactly what was painted." Sarah's mind reeled. Charleston, 1870. Just 5 years after the 13th Amendment abolished slavery. The South was under Reconstruction, the economy shattered, racial violence everywhere. For a black woman to possess such wealth, to be painted like aristocracy, it should have been impossible. "Who was she?" Marcus asked quietly. Sarah stared at the restored portrait, at the woman's knowing eyes that seemed to hold secrets spanning a century and a half. "I don't know, but I'm going to find out." Sarah spent the next 2 weeks buried in the Smithsonian archives, pulling every document related to Charleston from 1865 to 1875. She examined census records, property deeds, marriage certificates, death notices, anything that might provide a clue. The portrait itself offered few answers. No signature from the artist. No name on the subject. Just that brass plate. Portrait 1870, Charleston. "I've been thinking about the Beaumont house," James said during lunch. "That mansion was built in 1820 by the Beaumont family, plantation owners. They lost everything in the war. The house was sold in 1869 to pay debts." "Who bought it?" Sarah asked immediately. James pulled out his tablet. "That's the strange part. The property records show it was purchased by something called the Freeman Trust. I can't find any other references to this entity anywhere. Sarah felt that familiar tingle of discovery. A trust with Freeman in the name. Buying a former plantation mansion right after the war. That's not coincidence. She returned to the archives with new purpose, this time searching for Freeman Trust in Charleston records. Hours passed. The words blurred on the microfilm screen. Then, in a legal notice from the Charleston Mercury newspaper dated March 1869, she found it. Notice is hereby given that the property known as Beaumont House has been acquired by the Freeman Trust, established for the benefit of formerly enslaved persons and their descendants. Sarah's heart raced. She printed the notice and kept searching. 2 pages later, another mention, this time listing the trustees. 3 names appeared: Reverend Morris Jackson, Attorney Samuel Rhodes, and the trust's administrator, Miss Elizabeth Hayes, formerly of the Beaumont household. Elizabeth Hayes. Sarah wrote the name in her notebook, her hand trembling slightly. Could this be the woman in the portrait? Finding Elizabeth Hayes proved harder than Sarah anticipated. The name appeared nowhere in standard genealogical databases. It was as if she had been deliberately erased from history. That's not unusual for the period, explained Dr. Angela Roberts, a specialist in African American history whom Sarah consulted. Many records of black lives were simply never kept or were destroyed, especially for people who might have been threats to the white power structure. But she had wealth, Sarah argued, enough to buy a mansion, commission an expensive portrait. That should have left traces. Angela smiled sadly, which is exactly why those traces would have been erased. A wealthy black woman in 1870 Charleston. That would have been terrifying to white supremacists trying to restore their control. Sarah returned to primary sources, actual newspapers from the period. In the Charleston Daily News from April 1869, she found a brief, venomous editorial. It is reported that the Beaumont property has fallen into the hands of certain Negroes styling themselves trustees. This affront to decency and the natural order shall not stand unopposed by respectable citizens. 3 months later, another mention. The colored woman calling herself administrator of the so-called Freeman Trust continues to occupy the Beaumont residence, despite protests from neighboring property owners. She was making enemies, Sarah murmured. But who was Elizabeth Hayes before she became wealthy? Where did the money come from? The answer came from an unexpected source. Marcus discovered a collection of private letters donated to the South Carolina Historical Society by a Charleston family. Among them, a letter dated 1868 from Margaret Beaumont to her cousin in Virginia. Father's debts have finally forced the sale. Most humiliating of all, the house has been purchased by Elizabeth. Yes, mother's former lady's maid. How she obtained such funds remains a mystery that torments me nightly. Elizabeth Hayes had been enslaved in the very house she later owned. Sarah booked a flight to Charleston. She needed to examine local records that had never been digitized. Documents that might explain how an enslaved woman became wealthy enough to buy her former owner's mansion. The Charleston County Archives occupied a modern building near the historic district. The archivist, an older black man named Thomas Wright, showed immediate interest when Sarah explained her research. Elizabeth Hayes, he repeated thoughtfully. That name sounds familiar, but I can't place it. Let me show you the property records from that period. They spent hours going through ledgers. The Beaumont house sale was recorded on June 15, 1869. Purchase price, $12,000, an enormous sum for the time, especially considering the devastated post-war economy. Where would she get that kind of money? Sarah wondered aloud. Thomas pulled another ledger. Let's look at other transactions under her name. They found 3 more properties purchased between 1867 and 1870, all in Charleston's commercial district. These were businesses, Thomas explained. Look at the addresses. This one became a dry goods store. This one a boarding house. She was an entrepreneur, Sarah said, excitement building. But that still doesn't explain the initial capital. You need money to make money. Thomas sat back, studying the dates. You know what this reminds me of? There were rumors, just rumors, never proven, about enslaved people hiding valuables during the war. Confederate gold, family jewelry, things their owners buried or hid that were never recovered. You think she found hidden treasure? Sarah asked skeptically. I think she knew things, Thomas corrected. She worked in that house her whole life. She would have known every secret, every hiding place. When the Beaumont family fled during Sherman's approach in 1865, Elizabeth stayed behind. She had 4 years before they returned and tried to reclaim their property. Sarah felt pieces clicking together. 4 years to search every corner of that mansion. Thomas remembered that the Beaumont family papers had been donated to the Charleston Museum in the 1950s. The next morning, Sarah sat in the museum's reading room with 3 boxes of letters, diaries, and financial documents. The picture they painted was of a family in slow-motion collapse. Robert Beaumont, the patriarch, had been a prosperous rice plantation owner before the war. His diary from 1860 cataloged his wealth: 200 enslaved people, 3,000 acres, annual income of $50,000, a fortune at the time. Then came the war. Robert's entries grew increasingly desperate. By 1864, with Union forces approaching, he wrote, "Have taken precautions to secure family assets. M knows nothing of the details. Only I possess knowledge of the location." M was clearly his wife, Margaret. Sarah flipped ahead frantically. The next entry was dated April 1865, written in a shaky hand. "Charleston fallen. Our cause lost. Everything is lost." There were no more entries after that. Robert Beaumont died in August 1865, possibly by suicide according to a family letter. Margaret and their daughter tried to maintain the property, but debts and taxes overwhelmed them. In a letter from Margaret to her sister, dated November 1865, Sarah found a telling passage. "Elizabeth remains with us, though we can no longer pay wages. She says she has nowhere else to go. I confess her loyalty in these dark times brings some comfort, though I trust her less than I once did. She asked too many questions about Robert's business affairs." Sarah sat back, her mind racing. Elizabeth had stayed in the house while the family crumbled. She had asked questions. She had searched. A separate folder contained an inventory of Beaumont property taken in 1869 before the forced sale. Sarah scanned the list: furniture, paintings, silverware. At the bottom, a handwritten note. Multiple items of value previously recorded in family ledgers could not be located. Estimated loss: $15,000, $20,000. Elizabeth had found Robert Beaumont's hidden fortune. Sarah knew she needed more than financial records and property deeds. She needed to understand Elizabeth as a person. Through Thomas's connections in Charleston's Black historical community, she was introduced to Dorothy Hayes, an elderly woman living in a nursing home on James Island. "My great-great-grandmother was named Elizabeth," Dorothy said when Sarah visited. "Family stories say she did something remarkable after slavery ended, but the details were always vague. My grandmother said it was safer not to talk about it." "Why safer?" Sarah asked. Dorothy's eyes grew distant. "Because white folks didn't like it when black people got ahead. My grandmother remembered stories of night riders, threats, violence. Elizabeth had to be careful, very careful." "Do you have any family documents? Letters? Photographs?" Dorothy shook her head. "Most was lost over the years. But wait." She reached into a drawer beside her bed and pulled out a small wooden box. Inside was a faded tintype photograph of a young woman, circa 1870s, and a folded piece of paper. Sarah's hands trembled as she recognized the face from the portrait. "That's her. That's Elizabeth." The paper was a letter, dated 1872, written in elegant script. "My dear niece Rebecca, I write to tell you that I have purchased your freedom papers and those of your children. You are to come to Charleston immediately. I have established a home here where our family may finally live in dignity and safety. What I have built for us all. Do not fear the journey. Fear only remaining in bondage when freedom awaits. Your aunt, Elizabeth. She bought family members out of debt servitude." Sarah whispered. She wasn't just securing her own freedom. She was liberating others. Dorothy smiled through tears. She saved 17 family members between 1870 and 1875, bought their freedom papers, brought them to Charleston, helped them start businesses. That's why we're still here. Back in Washington, Sarah dove into newspapers from 1870, 1875, now knowing what to look for. The story that emerged was both inspiring and terrifying. Elizabeth Hayes hadn't just been wealthy. She had been openly, defiantly successful. The Charleston Daily News carried multiple hostile articles about her. One from August 1871 dripped with racist venom. The Negro woman Hayes continues her presumptuous occupation of the Beaumont mansion, entertaining other Negroes in a grotesque mockery of civilized society. She parades through town in fine dresses, attended by servants, as if she were quality. This inversion of the natural order is an insult to every white citizen and cannot be tolerated indefinitely. Sarah found evidence of escalating threats. A letter from Elizabeth to her attorney, Samuel Rhodes, dated September 1871. "Dear Mr. Rhodes, I must report another incident. Last night, men on horseback circled the property, firing guns and shouting threats. This is the third such occurrence this month. I have hired guards and refuse to be intimidated, but I confess concern for the safety of my household. I am particularly worried about the children. Please advise on legal protections available. The Ku Klux Klan was at its height during this period. Sarah found testimony from a congressional investigation into Klan violence in South Carolina. One anonymous witness described an attack planned against the uppity colored woman in the big house who thinks she's white folk. The attack never happened, Sarah discovered, because Elizabeth had done something extraordinary. She had hired Union Army veterans, both black and white, as security. She had connections with Republican politicians. She had made herself too visible, too protected to attack without consequences. She survived through a combination of courage and strategy, James observed when Sarah shared her findings. She was brilliant, but the question remained: why had her story been forgotten? The answer came from Charleston city directories and census records. Sarah traced Elizabeth's life year by year. The Freeman Trust thrived through the early 1870s. Elizabeth appeared in the 1870 census as Negro, female, age 28, occupation property manager. The 1872 city directory listed her as administrator of the Freeman Trust, with 4 properties under management. Then, in 1875, everything changed. The Compromise of 1877 ended Reconstruction. Federal troops withdrew from the South. White Democrats violently reclaimed power through what they called redemption. Sarah found a chilling article in the Charleston News and Courier from November 1876. Order has been restored to our fair city. The various Negro establishments that had operated under federal protection have been persuaded to close or transfer to appropriate management. The Beaumont property has been returned to the Beaumont family, righting a grievous wrong perpetrated during the dark days of radical Republican rule. Returned? Sarah frantically searched property records. In December 1876, the Beaumont house was indeed transferred back to Margaret Beaumont's daughter for $1. Elizabeth's other properties were similarly transferred through legal maneuvers that Sarah recognized as obvious fraud. Deeds were declared invalid. Titles were challenged. Black property owners faced violence and exile if they resisted. But what happened to Elizabeth herself? Sarah found her in the 1880 census, living in Philadelphia, age 38, occupation, domestic servant. She had lost everything and fled north. Her wealth, her properties, her achievement, all stripped away when white supremacy was violently restored. The portrait, Sarah realized, had remained in the Beaumont house attic because the Beaumonts wanted to erase Elizabeth's story. They hid the evidence of her triumph, buried it in an attic where it would be forgotten. For 145 years, it had worked, until now. Sarah organized a press conference at the Smithsonian. The restored portrait hung in the center of the room, Elizabeth's face radiating dignity and strength. Dorothy Hayes sat in the front row, surrounded by 17 descendants of the family members Elizabeth had freed. "This is Elizabeth Hayes," Sarah began, her voice steady but emotional. In 1870, she was one of the wealthiest black women in South Carolina. She used her wealth not for personal luxury, but to liberate family members from debt bondage and build economic security for her community. She survived violent white supremacist backlash through courage and strategic alliances. She was erased from history when Reconstruction ended and white Democrats violently reclaimed power. The portrait appeared on every major news outlet. Historians called it one of the most significant discoveries of the decade, concrete evidence of black wealth and achievement during Reconstruction and of the systematic violence used to destroy it. The Smithsonian acquired the portrait for its permanent collection. The Charleston Museum created an exhibit about Elizabeth and the Freeman Trust. A documentary filmmaker reached out to tell her story. But for Sarah, the most meaningful moment came 3 months later. She stood with Dorothy and the other descendants at the Beaumont House, now officially renamed the Elizabeth Hayes House, and converted into a museum dedicated to African American history during Reconstruction. She bought this house in 1869 as an act of defiance, Sarah said during the dedication. She lived here as an act of courage, and though they took it from her, though they tried to erase her story, she left us this portrait. She left us proof that she existed, that she mattered, that she built something extraordinary. Dorothy placed her hand on the portrait, tears streaming down her face. "Welcome home, Aunt Elizabeth," she whispered. The portrait hung in the entrance hall of the Elizabeth Hayes house. Elizabeth's eyes meeting every visitor, her story finally told, her legacy finally restored.